Let me introduce these chaps sort of a little bit, Craig, and then we'll see.
Yeah, then we'll get started.
Sort of push on. So yeah, this morning's episode is on cycling, as everyone's probably read, and we are sort of delighted to have two people. Rob, a physiotherapist who is a good friend and ex-colleague of mine based in London, although Australian himself, and Nathan, a podiatrist based in Brisbane. And these two guys, between them, have pretty much, if you have any aspirations to work in cycling and see cyclists and work with the elite, and you just got to look at these two guys' CVs, and they've pretty much got the CV that you're gonna envy. So we're really looking forward to talking to them both about sort of cycling and cycling injuries. Rob, leaning on Rob for his bike fit knowledge and things, leaning on Nathan for his understanding of orthoses and their use in cycling, and given that he's the co-founder of a lab. Forgive me, Nathan, I've forgotten what your orthoses lab's called.
Cobra9, mate.
Cobra9. Apologies. Are there 8 other Cobra orthoses labs? Or?
No. It's a tremendous joke, and there's so much mileage, mate. So I appreciate it.
Do they still make the socks?
We make the socks. They're I'll have you all say Cobra 9.5, the next generation, you know.
Yeah, so to anyone watching, if you've got any questions about cycling or cycling injuries or bike fit or cycling orthoses while you're watching, just ping them into the comments, and you know, Craig will keep an eye on those comments, and we'll get to them. But we've got a few questions that have come in beforehand that we're just going to put in some kind of what we think is a logical order, and we'll sort of rifle through those. Have you shared everywhere, Craig? You happy for us to?
Yeah, we're all good to go.
Awesome, great. So we'll start with one for you, Rob, which is of all the questions that came in, the most common one we got, and that is, you know, what is a bike fit? What does a bike fit look like for someone who's never experienced one, or someone who might be thinking about referring a patient to have one?
Yeah, good question. Good place to start too, because we can do a bit of an overall view of someone on the bike. I guess it's very varied. So with a bike fitting trade, you could get anywhere from someone like a mechanic putting someone on a bike all the way through to some really, really fancy equipment, even up to sort of Vicon 3D analysis. I think at the end of the day, it is all about the individual and how well they can move on the bike. And that's what you're trying to do. So you're looking at how someone moves for efficiency. So performance and injury prevention, optimal loading, and also for what they want as well. Like if they're a time trialist, if they're a professional, if they're or if they're just an old lady going down the shops every day. And so I think that's the ultimate goal, is what you want. It's very varied between different people. But if we start at a general level, so seat height, I think you want the seat height so that the knee can move within about sort of 135 degrees up to about 70 degrees, and just keeping within that range seems to be quite nice. If you're not overextending or overflexing, if the seat's too low, you'll overflex and put a lot of pressure on the knee. If the seat's too high, then you'll overextend and cause a little bit of hamstring, posterior knee pain, etc. Then you're looking at, I guess, the difference between the saddle height and the handlebars. So if you look at neutral, you'll be there. If the handlebars come down, then you'll need a lot more flexion within the lower back. And that's sort of seems to be a big cause of lower back pain, is how much flexion someone needs and has to have sustained flexion on the bike. A really quick assessment of that is a sort of a straight leg raise. So how much hip and lower back flexion can someone get will indicate how low or how aggressive they can get. And that seems to be a really big difference between pros and amateurs, is how much flexion they can get. And they're sort of your two really big quick markers. But then you're looking at, you know, some fine adjustments of, you know, how far forward the saddle goes and how far back, in relation to how far forward it goes. So if you bring the saddle forward, then you're going to bring the knee more forward over the forefoot, and seems to be a cause of anterior knee pain as well, because then you need to change the axis of forces, etc. Similar to, you know, if you're going to do a squat or a lunge or a step up, and you do it with your knee coming over the forefoot, then you're going to load more through those anterior structures. So getting that loaded as well. So there are some, but that's a very rough, very rough overview, and there are some intricacies based on, you know, how people load and their injuries as well. And then if we're going to look at the foot and the cleat setup, which I'd actually do first, I get the cleat and the foot right. If someone does have a cleat, then the first thing they want is a very good, well-fitting shoe. And I guess, Nathan, we can talk more about this and the intricacies about the pressure through the foot. But for a cleat setup, I like it a neutral or a starting position as if you put the axis of the pedal sort of between or under the ball of the foot or under the fifth met. And so that'll be straight through the middle. And then whether or not you go forwards or backwards will be dependent on what type of cyclist the person is, what they want to achieve, and also how they're loading.
And when it comes to setup, you know, when we write sort of prescriptions for orthoses, a lot of us are writing them with a pathology in mind, so to speak. Does that factor into your setup as well? You know, do you set up to what is optimal, or do you sometimes make a tweak for a certain pathology and say to them, when this settles, we'll set your bike up differently? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, a little bit of both. Because I'm a physiotherapist, the main people I'll get for bike fitting will have an injury, and so you'll be setting up for, okay, how are we going to manage that injury? So how are we going to change load, or how are we going to change things so the person can get better? So it's not so much a performance focus. However, so that's the first goal, is to get someone cycling pain-free on the bike. And then we can talk about, okay, what are you going to do to improve the performance? But around the foot, so cycling is, I guess you'd class it as non-weight bearing. And so if you're sitting in the saddle, you're probably only ever going to put about, you know, just under your body weight of load through your body. So it's a lot less than running. So you don't get so much of those overload tendinopathy type injuries. The most common foot injuries are more, I guess, over pressure related. And so the way I visualize it is we're going to shift pressure. We're going to shift pressure around in your shoe, and we're going to get that pressure so it's optimally distributed and minimizing injury and also comfort. The other thing that I like to set up, and this is becoming a lot more important within cycling, is how you direct the force. So if you think about your crank arm on your bike is, you know, going around from 0 degrees all around to 180, is that how efficient is your force? So the most efficient force you want is perpendicular to the crank. Anything other than that, the force is going to be shot out and you're going to lose force. So one big role that the foot has is to actually orientate the foot relative to the crank, and so to get a most efficient as well. So I do have that in mind, as well as that, you know, pedaling technique and optimal force transition to the pedal.
Cool. You mentioned common foot issues, and that's been one of the questions as well. So we might come back to bike setup and when we talk about orthoses and cleat, but I just want to bring Nathan in as the podiatrist, if that's okay. Although you can answer this too afterwards if you want. One of the questions came in is what are the common foot issues? What sort of things are you seeing a lot of, or should you expect to see a lot of if you start working with cyclists?
Sure. Rob makes a good point before, and probably should expand on it a little bit just before I get onto that, about level of load and level of pressure through the feet. And I think as podiatrists, we need to be a little bit aware that we only have a certain limitation on our ability to affect pressure in a broad bike context. So the notion that by insoles and side shoes we can take pressure off feet it's nice, and it sort of works, but it would be remiss of us not to understand that we can reap far greater change sometimes by impacting the bike fit, and that has implications back on foot pressures as well. So I think if you're relying solely upon the notion of trying to change in-shoe pressures just through the insole rather than looking at the contact points around that, you're in trouble straight away. So I think if you're a podiatrist who doesn't know a lot about cycling and about maybe the issues around in-shoe pressure, then it's a good idea to refer or defer to someone like a Robert who can help bring down someone's peak pressure points by maybe changing their saddle height or by changing the length of crank to help in a much more broad aspect, where if you're trying to fight in-shoe pressures alone by trying to change insoles and you're not getting anywhere, you may find that your level of intervention is limited by that. So whilst Bike Fit, and I'm sure Robert would agree with me here, whilst Bike Fit has a lot of murky areas in terms of its accuracies and what the overall setup is, its impact upon us as podiatrists and in-shoe pressure is quite high. And we shouldn't just try and solve all the problems from the podiatry aspect. And referring across to a good physio / bike fitter is very, very important. It makes good sense. Common foot issues. I think we have a very unique practice here in Brisbane, and we predominantly see cyclists. So out of our caseload, 85% of our patients are cyclists. So we see very, very few non-cycling patients. So I guess in terms of a window, or as a percentage of what we see, we've got a pretty good sort of ratio to draw some conclusions. By far the most common reason clients will come and see us in terms of their comfort is pressure. So hot spots, burning feet, numbness. 80% at least is that's the issue. So people come in and say, I'll ride for half an hour, I'll ride for an hour, and my feet start to burn, or my toes start to go numb. The outside of my foot starts to become sore. So that's by far the most consistent pathology we see in a cycling context with our podiatry patients. Beyond that, the issues more proximally, knee pain, hip pain occasionally as well, but certainly in-shoe pressure issues are by far the most common. Occasionally arch strain, and also the vagaries around fitting shoes adequately. So probably every second patient we see has issues with their shoes. And cycling shoes aren't like running shoes. They aren't necessarily as comfortable or as easy to fit. I can see Rob smiling at the moment. And the cycling shoe market has a certain sort of style they use. As a consequence, getting adequately sized shoes for people and fitting that style of shoe with their visual relationship with that shoe is quite difficult. So someone wants to wear a shoe, doesn't fit their foot, they'll squeeze their foot in there, and then they come and see us with all sorts of problems. And then talking them down from that pair of shoes is often the hardest part, as opposed to treating them. But I think if you're a podiatrist and you're starting to see cyclists, expect to see a lot of forefoot-based pathology, a lot of burning, numbness, tingling. And people, I was asked this question last week at the conference in Queensland. Someone said, do we really see many foot problems in cycling? Because it really is only, as Rob was saying, a non-weight-bearing activity of sorts. But whilst it is non-weight-bearing, the level of load and the repetition involved is enormous. So small problems can become enormous over a 2 to 3 hour ride, or even longer. And there are a small portion, but a meaningful portion of cyclists that we see here who cannot get beyond half an hour of riding before they have to stop and get off the bike and take their feet out of the shoes. And it's that level of discomfort, as opposed to, it hurts a little bit. It's that ride-affecting pain. So you can get levels of pathology to feet in a cycling context, which can end their love affair with the sport. So there are some real challenges around that.
Yeah. Actually, Rob, just on that, say if you've got a typical runner who might say run for an hour a day, based on what you're saying, the typical cyclist might ride for 2 hours a day. Is that?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, a small ride is 2 hours.
Okay,
yeah. So you probably wouldn't do it, and that's exactly right. And what Nathan was saying is that although it's not a high load, it's more of a repetition. Yeah. So you get more of this pressure and then wearing down. So even the tendinopathies, or they're not a proper mid-substance tendinopathy because of they don't really eccentrically load. It's a lot of paratendinopathies, a lot of inflammatory issues just from this constant repetition and rubbing and pressure.
Yeah, at least a trail runner will get a lot of variability that a cyclist
will get. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. I think this is perhaps the reason why what we do here has changed, and the reason why we can have a practice this niche-based in a capital city is that, cycling historically, it used to be a hobby. We'd go for half an hour with our kids, and that was like a normal level of recreational cycling. Whereas, we see recreational cyclists in here these days who'll do 15, 20 hours of cycling a week. And that's not uncommon. So the level of repetition and the level of volume being undertaken by your average recreational cyclist these days has skyrocketed with all these fondos and challenges and Strava, which is an online ride sharing platform. As a consequence, the types of pathologies and frequency of patients we're seeing as cyclists is increasing all the time. So it's gone from being an occasional sand shoe wearing mountain bike with the kids sport to I've got to have all the gear. I've got to go and do my 3 hours that my coach has told me to do on Monday. And then as a consequence, we're getting more and more pathology. So if you're a podiatrist with that angle, then certainly going forward, it's likely you're going to see more and more patients as a consequence of this ever-increasing volume of most recreational cyclists.
Yeah, I struggle to find time to go for a run, let alone go for a cycle. Nathan, just following up, you made a comment on the footwear. Now, obviously, in running shoes, there is an extraordinary amount of research going in, extraordinary amount of tech going in, extraordinary amount of obsession. Is that same kind of obsession and tech going into cycling shoes, or is it not quite as
interesting? I think the running shoe tech, and I saw you mention this just recently on your one of your blogs, Craig, about the ride of running shoes, and so I was just giving you some free marketing there, mate. The cycle, there's no question that in the sport of cycling, there's ever increasingly, important attitude towards improvements in technology, not just in terms of cycling shoes, but also in terms of bikes, kit, position, and bike fit. Like the type of bike fit setup we see these days versus when bike fit perhaps started in its infancy is enormously different. And setups for bike fit can cost $20,000, $30,000 just for the motion capturing facilities and the 3D and the live screen. So the tech's improving across the whole space, in kit as well, and bikes especially. The shoes, the tech is increasing as well, but it is changing. It is improving. I think despite that, we still are pretty much stuck in this carbon sole synth leather upper combination. There's not the same level of shift in terms of technology with running shoes, where we're seeing different densities of midsoles and different platforms and different heel pitches. It's very much, we still want to have the stiff, like the tech is stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. And you have brands that every year bring out and add an extra number to their stiffness factors to create more stiffness. So if you ever want to capture a cyclist's imagination, just start talking about stiffness. And, they're going to lightness. That's and lightness, stiffness and lightness. So the tech around shoes has improved with they've got lighter and they've got stiffer, but by no means that made them any more comfortable. And I'd argue in some ways, cycling shoes over the last 20 to 30 years have actually become less comfortable in the pursuit of performance. Whereas by the early incarnations were essentially shoes that were more leather-soled, pliable upper shoes with flexibility you used to screw into your cleats. Whereas now it is get the stiffest, most lightweight, basic apparatus to try and get the performance gains. And you can imagine as a consequence of that, you put a nice, soft, supple, human anatomy into a carbon-soled shoe, and hilarity does not ensue.
Oh, sure.
Let me just touch back on something you said, Nathan, and bring a bit more of a clinical slant back in, if that's okay. I totally agree with your point about, if as a podiatrist, setting yourself up alongside a physio, alongside someone who bike fits. And as Rob will testify, I send 100% of my cyclists to him. But talk us through the clinical reasoning that comes in, and it sort of leans on a question that's just coming from Karen, saying any hints on how we can treat the numbness you described. So let's say the cyclist comes in with a numb, complaining of a numb, burning, tingling foot. Leaning on how we would consider when we look at a runner, and we'd say, is this a proximally driven problem? Is this a distally driven problem? Is this a footwear problem? Where does your thought process start? Does it start with the shoe? Does it start with orthoses? Does it start with the bike fit?
Question. Excellent question. And like in a running context, the answer is not always short or easy. But whenever I see a patient, and I'm sure you guys are the same, because I hold you all in high regard with regards to clinical skill sets. Whenever you see a patient coming in, you'll see levels of normality of their anatomy. But irrespective of that, the prime basis for intervention for me still is pain or pathology. So if someone comes to see me, irrespective of how their foot looks, I'm going to ask them, where does it hurt? Where is it numb? And from that point forward, it's a case of trying to uncover what is the driving force, what are the driving influences behind that pathology, rather than getting stuck into the issue, stuck into that sort of connecting deformity with problems. So you will see cyclists who come in here regularly who've got feet which look very abnormal, and they've got no problems, and they've got no pain. So it's very hard to make that person more pain-free if they're already pain-free. They may come and see us because someone's asked them to come and see us because they've been told that what we do is pretty cool, and we might do some funky stuff with them, but it's harder to treat that person because what are you trying to achieve at the end of the day? If someone comes and sees us with an example of, say, numbness or burning in their feet, and we're going to try and isolate the underlying factors which are influencing that. And unfortunately, the basis around that numbness or burning isn't as straightforward as a one-to-one ratio. So if someone comes to see us and says, my foot is burning in the forefoot, there isn't this instant connection of, okay, as a consequence of that, you must have a shoe which is too tight, or you must have a neuroma or some sort of neurasthenia. Because I think when you start to create those sort of arbitrary connections, you start treating people all in the same fashion, and the outcomes aren't necessarily very good consequence. So there is a little bit of clinical skill that comes back into that process, and it's not easy to say, simplify that to the nth degree to say numbness means you have to have the same intervention process. But certainly, if someone comes to see us with numbness, the 2 or 3 things we'll mainly look at. One would be, is there an element of compression within their footwear? Is their shoe too tight? Is their shoe too loose? Because loose shoes can have a similar issue as well. But is their shoe just far too tight for their foot? As a consequence, is it creating some type of compression-based issue? And again, I think that has been overlooked a lot in the past as a consequence of people assuming the shoes always fit well, but you need to make sure the shoe fits well. Beyond that, if the footwear is appropriate, the next thing we're looking at is there any isolated locations or is there any isolated anatomy on the sole of their foot which would drive peak pressure in that location? Is there a plantar flex structure? Is there a reduced fat pad? Or is there some way that this person is pedaling, but they're loading up that structure more intrinsically as a consequence? And then beyond that, we have to look at things like pedal location. Is a pedal in the right location? Is it too far forward or too far back, driving higher peak pressures? Are the crank arms too long? Is someone trying to drive huge torque because their crank arm is so long they're driving a low cadence? Someone's seat height too low? So it's not necessarily one reason for that as an outcome, but certainly looking at a few of those key features: shoe width, anatomy, pedal technique, bike setup. And again, we're very fortunate here because we've got a Rob type person in our practice. We've got Anushka, who's a bike fit physio as well. I'm not sure if you know Anushka Edwards, Robert.
Yeah, I know of her.
Yeah. So we have, she's worked with the Great Britain para team for a long time.
That's right,
so, so we have the ability to defer and refer as a consequence. But I think, like, I've been treating cyclists almost exclusively for the last 4 years and a lot for the last 10 years. And some of these features around crank length and cadence and bike setup and its influence upon, say, forefoot pressure and discomfort have only really appeared on my radar over the last 4 or 5 years. So it comes down to removing your preconceived notions of why you think they'll always have the same problem or same pain, and then addressing each one individually and treating each one individually as well. That answer that question?
That's good. Yeah, perfect. It's good to hear because I often see cyclists that come in with a numb foot and they've purchased some kind of device themselves, or they've been sold something somewhere and they've crammed it in the shoe, and what do you know, it's all got a bit worse, and they've come
that's a good point.
You expecting for one solution, and I start saying to them, right, well, I'm going to need to see my colleague to look at your bike first and foremost, and suddenly they're like, oh, I didn't really plan to spend this much money. I was like, well, it's just that education, isn't it?
It's a good point. I think I think that is what I've seen probably as a common problem with treatment for numbness over the years, is people will tend to have numbness in the ball of their foot, and one of their riding friends or a well-wishing colleague or a practitioner will say, well, you've got numbness, you must have a neuroma. So because you have a neuroma, we must have this arbitrary intervention of a metatarsal dome. Totally. Metatarsal dome inside the shoes, and metatarsal domes are weird and wacky things at the best of times, but when they go into a shoe which is already too tight and increase the volume further, surprisingly they get worsening of their symptoms. So it is really important. I think from what I've seen from patients coming in to see me, there's no question the most frequently used intervention for numbness is metatarsal dome, and I've seen all sorts of homemade fashions applied to insoles over the years to try and offset conditions. On occasion, they'll have some degree of success, on occasion and will have a degree of worsening of symptomology. So it's important that you isolate whether the shoe fit is appropriate first. Otherwise, adding a mectome is only going to add problems.
Sure, but I'm sure, Nathan, you realise that that's something that's not unique to cyclists.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
And it's only going to get worse, you know.
Yeah, I think the reason why metatarsal domes are particularly inherently risky in cycling comes back to what we were saying before with regards to the repetition of the activity. Is that if you're trying to create this lever arm, you know, this foot as a lever arm for cycling, and if you have a foot which is under load and it's trying to become stiffer to try and provide a more efficient propulsion method, and if you then put this foreign lump under the distal metatarsal region to try and offload pain, it can be a very, very uncomfortable experience for a cyclist. And again, you throw in 90 to 100 repetitions per minute for 3 or 4 hours in a row, and that little metatarsal that you put in there to try and offset some of this neuroma type pain comes back at you on a Monday morning and says, "What have you done to me? I can't tolerate this." So, when used appropriately and when appropriate, they can be useful, but I think there's no question that there's a severe overprescription of metatarsal domes amongst cyclists suffering from forefoot pain.
I think any forefoot pain that's considered intermetatarsal neuroma or space occupying lesion, met dome, even outside of cycling, is the kind of go-to first one. And for me, we refer to them as Marmite or Vegemite for you guys, in that, you know, people love them or hate them. There's not really anyone that kind of says, yeah, that felt okay. It's either great success or it's, you know, like you say, what have you done to me? My least favourite pathology to see across the board is that kind of pathology, even in non-cyclists, to be honest. There's been a few questions that have just come in actually about orthoses. So I guess we may as well come on to that now, if that's okay, while we're talking about met domes. First of all, a question for Rob, and that is, because I know even as a physio, you know, you are allowed to give orthoses, right? We're not the kind of people that we're not going to stone you for admitting it. But at what point do you make the decision about whether to intervene in shoe versus out shoes? So something in shoe versus something in between the sort of shoe pedaling.
Yeah, good question, because I think that's one of the obviously a really big difference between running and cycling is that you do have that option to go in or out. So for what Ian's talking about is you've got the pedal, the cleat, and then the shoe. And so we can have, you know, a normal insole, which will go inside the shoe, just like a runner, or you can actually put something between the pedal and the cleat. So between the pedal and the cleat, you'll tend to get an overall movement. So varus, valgus, etc. If you put something in the shoe, you can have much more of an effect on different variables, and that's where I like to go in shoe more than out shoe, purely because of some of the best reasoning of why someone may need an insole or what effect an insole is going to have in a cyclist, and that's more with the perception, the comfort, and the contours. And because we come back to that issue is okay. And it'll be interesting to hear Nathan's thought on how the foot moves within cycling. And that's something that's really not well defined at all, probably worse than running. And because we don't have the option of watching someone cycle bare feet and having a look at them, I think the best that we've got is probably pressure mapping and pedal angles. And so what we're after is more of even pressure and how well it's distributed, the force. And so if we can get something within there that can change pressures, and if it's comfortable and contoured, then that seems to have the most effect in the patients that I see, rather than actually trying to change mechanics. Because at the end of the day, what we want is the foot as a rigid lever, and how well and efficiently it can just transfer force from the hips, knee, quads, etc., all the way down into the pedal. And that's a big reason why they make cycling shoes so stiff, is that they have no forefoot flexion whatsoever, and it's actually seen as a disadvantage if any shoe can flex. So it's this really rigid structure. And so, you know, about 2/3 of the pressure will go through the forefoot, very, very little through the heel, very, very little through the midfoot and through the arch. And whether or not that actually moves. I mean, there's no windlass effect or anything like that. So your goals and what you're trying to achieve and what you can influence are already different to running and to more of those dynamic movements. However, in saying that, you seem to get better effects when you have a full length orthotic. Why is that? Well, I think it's because of the comfort and the contours. If someone is pushing down and they feel that contour against their foot, then they tend to be able to change their pressure patterns through onto the front third of their foot. And comfort and proprioception seems to be the biggest factor. So in terms of then, I don't do prescription made. So if I'm going to do something, I'll put in off the shelf, or even when I start, if someone has an orthotic in their walking shoe or running shoe, I'll actually say to them, does it fit in your cycling shoe? Let's have a go at that. How does it change things? And then we can move from there.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Jim, I remember you introduced me many years ago when we were working together to these 4-foot wedges. Were they called low wedge? If I remember that
they were specialised. So they were just a 4-foot wedge. Yeah, valgus or varus wedge.
You moved away from that now, and you find that when you go full length, there's just much better outcomes. I mean, we'll ask Nathan's take on this in a minute as well. But
yeah, it seems to be more in a comfort point of view. So, I mean, if they have a really, really comfortable shoe and they feel good through the heel and through the midfoot, then we can always go a wedge. But why I like the wedges, and the case in particular that you're talking about is, and then Nathan made a really good point about someone who comes into your clinic with pain. I think if you don't know cycling too well or have no cycling background, I think the first thing you do is just, treat them like a patient and find out exactly what their pathology is, what's causing it, and then we can sort of problem solve from there. So knowing that, and the patient that referred to me was lateral foot pain, and so he'd been through a couple of treatment management plans, and all got him close, but then he got back on the bike and he was not great on the bike. So he was good running, but couldn't ride for say more than 20 minutes, and he had this lateral foot pain. And so if you think it very, very simply, is that, okay, he's loading through his lateral foot too much. And on a bike stroke, I explained to the patients, because again, it's hard to measure, is that it's just like a calf raise. So you want, the loading will go through the front 1/3 of your foot, and you want a nice even distribution, maybe a little bit onto the first met, and then, but mainly just an even distribution around that front third. And having a good calf raise and a really good distribution of force on a calf raise is a really good way to describe it to my patients, and they'll feel it. And then all I did with this guy was throw in some wedges, throw him a little bit more medially to have a look at the effect of it. But it actually ended up being a really good treatment for him, and going from there. The other problem with him was he changed shoes, and his shoes were, the different brand of shoes was actually a little bit too varus. So you just have to watch the camber on the shoes as well, is that between each shoe and between each company, the shoes aren't flat, they'll actually varus that way. And so throwing a wedge in can bring them back into a little bit more of that better 4-foot loading pattern.
Perfect. So Nathan, let's get your take, because I think it's long been discussed that because the only interface between the bike and the person is at the pedal and the forefoot, that's where the magic happens. But certainly from Rob's comments and certainly my experience of working with him, that doesn't seem to be the case. And one of the questions that came in from, I've lost it now, I think it was from Sean, was, can you tell us what's special about cycling orthoses? So what about their design differs to, say, a walking or a running device?
Yeah, I think essentially a lot of the ability to impact the foot in the cycling context with cycling orthoses has probably changed since the shoes have changed. So I think there have been some studies around this regarding assessing angles and pressures cycling in sand shoes versus cycling shoes, and there is a distinct difference in terms of loading patterns as a consequence. So as the shoe becomes stiffer, the loading patterns change. And certainly there's a more evening out of the loading pattern through the forefoot as the cycling shoes become stiffer. there's a tendency to drive load back through the first net base of hallux in cycling shoes. As a consequence, I think it's differ as well. It's to do with the recruitment of first ray and driving it down. So there is a bit more of an evening out of pressure as a consequence. And we've done some pressure mapping ourselves in the lab down in Melbourne, actually, with the physiotherapist a few years ago, just to assess ourselves, where we're going, how much load is there around the foot when we're pedaling on a stiff sole shoe. And there is actually, surprise, even some load under the heel. Like, we'd assume there'd be no heel load at all, but in a carbon soled shoe with the cleats in its location, you actually do get a small amount of heel load, let alone forefoot load as well. So once you start to understand the fact that there's more of a platform being involved, the role of an orthosis bringing foot pressures and problems becomes more relevant from getting a greater platform. I think, interestingly enough, like having treated many non-cyclists as well as cyclists with orthotic therapy over the 20 years, the through use of cycling orthoses versus walking orthoses is far higher. So tolerance to them is much greater, and throughput usage is much higher. So people tend to be more comfortable in them than they do with a standard walking orthoses. And so we'll see a cyclist coming after 8 years, and they'll still be wearing those devices that we made for them 8 years ago because they just feel nice inside their shoes. So there is that kind of tangible, as Rob mentioned, that tangible foot comfort that comes from profiles and feedback and proprioception as well. I think when it comes to designing and creating a cycling orthosis as opposed to walking orthosis, you're not looking at the same sorts of parameters. So you shouldn't try and create a prescription in the same form. Rob touched on the idea of popping a walking orthotic into a cycling shoe. One of my pet loves have seen guys come in with their enormous 4.5 mil polypropylene CFOs and bang them inside a pair of tight-fitting cities and watching the pain ensue. But the ability to impact a foot with a cycling orthosis is quite relevant. So you can certainly move pressure around quite easily. You can load up structures in the forefoot and proximally to the forefoot and just even out loads. And we saw that in the lab setting by increasing the profile. We could see how the peak pressures in certain locations shifted around. We're not talking about 50% here. We're talking about small amounts, but we're talking again about repetition. So if you can shift the amount of load from a structure, even in a small way, over that 1, 2, 3, 4 hour ride, the difference can be quite enormous. Rob touched on this as well in terms of directing load. I think directing load is as important as moving load. I think if you can create a camber within the shoe itself with your device, you can then help shift where the actual central load pattern goes for the forefoot as someone is pedaling, and that can reduce peak load laterally or reduce peak load medially as a consequence. And again, primarily the main driver for us is, okay, where's your problem? Can we shift that load in a fashion which causes you no other problems and make you more comfortable riding? And then away you go, as opposed to trying to create some sort of perfect human being on the bike, which if you can look at what that is, then fantastic. I'm not sure what it is, but making someone improve their comfort on the bike by shifting load around. So I guess the key features, if you like, of cycling orthotic therapy is keeping the volume down. Like, you just don't have the space. You don't have the space in a cycling shoe to be creating these enormous devices, very often anyway. So you've got to bring down your device dimension to its absolute bare minimums. The reason why we use very, very thin carbon fibre in the devices that we make is that we can get some structure, but at no sacrifice of volume. So you can't get that level of rigidity, if you like, from creating a device from a very, very thin plastic or foam. It will just flex too much. So we use fibre to try and keep that stiffness and keep the volume right down. And we touched on this before with Rob. Cyclists like the idea of light things inside their shoes as well. So having very, very light orthoses inside shoes doesn't compromise what the shoe's intent was in the first place. Someone doesn't go and spend $500 on a pair of cycling shoes for the weight reduction for us to put 100 grams of insole inside their shoes. So if we can try and minimise our volume and still creating an outcome that we're after, we're fine. So most of the insoles that we'll create for cyclists will weigh 20, 25 grams. which is very, 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 very light and very, very low volume. And the tolerance as a consequence is quite high. You can probably do things a bit differently. You can do some, you can be a bit more aggressive in a cycling orthosis because you haven't got quite the same levels of foot shape change you would do, say, with walking. You can load more. You can load more proximally. You can load closer to the heads in a cycling context more than you can do in a walking context. But don't underestimate the importance of some of those old favourite prescription variables from a podiatry context around wedging and inverting and everting a shell, because you can get some fantastic shifts in load patterns around feet and knees as a consequence of that as well. And I think the stronger and the stiffer the shell you use when it's tolerated means the impact of any intervention you drive, say, in a varus or valgus context is more meaningful. If your insole is very, very soft and lacks that rigidity, you don't have that level of effect upon the foot, then wedging it won't be as effective. And I guess that's probably where we find most people have used metatarsal domes, our friends from before, is they'll have something which is very, very flexible or very, very low volume or very flat inside their shoes. In an attempt to create some profile for some proximal loading, they'll utilise metatarsal dome, which in some ways almost acts like their surrogate arch profile of their orthoses. It's something to rest against. If you give someone a meaningful profile in terms of their contours to try and drive some load more proximally, then if you add a dome on that again, you're going to get a whole lot of pressure that person's not likely to tolerate. So if you can get structure in there you need to, the use of metatarsal domes becomes less relevant.
Sure. Just on that, Nathan, I've got a little confession to make. I actually have a copy of this book.
And I
have had it for quite a while. But I remember when I got the book and you flick through it. Obviously, I went to the foot orthotic chapter, and I just couldn't stop. I haven't stopped rolling my eyes that 80% of cyclists have forefoot varus.
Varus, yes.
And then you come across websites like this. This is a bike fit website. Forefoot varus, 87% of people are affected.
4% normal, apparently. 4% normal.
Affected. It's an affliction. They're affected.
I know damn well forefoot varus.
Vaccine for this, Craig.
It's a disease. It's a disease.
Yeah, and I read that. I know forefoot varus is a prevalence of like 2%. But when I look at things like this here, you can see the wedging.
Yes.
So it's sort of what we're talking about. But this is what cyclists read, and this is what cyclists expect. And I just roll my eyes when I see 87% forefoot varus, and
the best part for that for me isn't the 87% forefoot varus. It's the 9% that are valgus. Which we've got a population of 4% who've got normal foot types. So as a profession, we're going to be pretty busy. We're pretty busy for the 50% level of normalcy.
No, but I read and see things like that, and I just roll my eyes. That you just seriously.
I think so. We have potential in the podiatry profession with the right sort of mindset around this, and the same with Robert's bike fit. If you're prepared to approach these things in a technical and informed light, and try and one of the things I'll say to podiatrists who I'm training on a semi-regular basis is, look, really understand the limit of what you can achieve here. Don't overestimate what you can get out of this. So people will come in and they'll be asking or hoping to get some level of meteoric change that sort of website will drive, like this notion of, if I put an ITS wedge inside somebody's shoes, I'm going to drive this knee location into the centralized, and it's going to be neat and tight, and it just doesn't work that way. That graphic you put up before, and I'd love to hear Rob's thoughts on this as well. It's fascinating because it has this very neat and tidy closed kinetic chain notion around putting something here that will have an effect over here. So we'll put on this forefoot varus foot type an ITS wedge. There you go. We'll put a wedge under the forefoot, and as a consequence, we're going to bring that knee out. And we've seen it before, and I've seen some of Ian's work before when he's discussed orthosis therapy for running, and how he's debunked these same sorts of beautiful diagrams in terms of orthotic therapy for valgus feet and how much it corrects things. But the interesting part with that, if you provided that same intervention for each patient with regards to various ITS wedging for that condition, you will actually make a portion of those patients a lot worse. there's a lot of evidence that's out there through decent quality studies that demonstrates that with a person that same bike fit setup should be given a valgus wedge rather than a varus wedge. Because the notion that if you put a varus wedge into somebody's foot, you're going to drive this sort of more centralized knee platform. Whereas if you put someone like that into a valgus wedge, you might just reduce some of the potential for more medial displacement. So you might actually reduce the travel. You might be able to reduce some of the kinetic load around the knee joint. So if you approach it forefoot varus wedging, ITS varus as a consequence will get improvement. You'll get patients who get worse. So you need to, again, treat each person individually and work out what's going to drive a better outcome for them rather than subscribe this 1 + 1 = 2 arrangement for every single case. And you'll get poor outcomes every time.
I think the flag for me in any of these images is when you see a red arrow
and then it goes green,
and the arrow goes green. I think whatever area you're looking at, cycling or otherwise, if you see that kind of approach, the alarm bell should go off. Craig, can you share that X-ray that I just forwarded to you?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
I'm sure you guys have seen this before. People watching might not have seen it, and it comes back to what Nathan said, which is expect to see a lot of forefoot pathology. And I think this X-ray kind of shows why quite nicely. You've seen this one, Rob. It might have even been you that sent it to me, Rob. Actually.
No, I have seen it before, but no, I didn't send it to you.
I've seen it before as a bit of a stitch up to say what type of procedure was performed in this patient.
So I think that's a reasonable thing to consider when you get patients coming in with forefoot pathology, not just the position of the cleat and all of the kind of metal work, but actually you look at the way that the foot's confined within that shoe. I mean, if that was a running shoe, we know we'd have the barefoot runners sort of up in arms about the way that was like a coffin for the foot. And that's just, there's no getting, they haven't made a barefoot cycling shoe yet, right?
No. Well, you may have started something there, Ian.
Patent pending. Yeah, it's more natural.
You heard it here first.
But do you want to leave that one there, Ian? If you want to just have a look, because that's not a bad indication of cleat placement. So if we look at the first met and the fifth met and draw a line straight diagonally through them, and that tends to be what I would, or is classed as a neutral setup of cleat position, and that's where I'll tend to start most of my bike fits. And getting that loading, and then you can move the cleat distally. So you're increasing the lever arm. Most cyclists will go a little bit forward. So as in the cleat a little bit more forward. I've never ever had any reasons to bring the cleat more proximal. So if you think about the foot as a lever arm, if we increase bring the cleats out towards the toes, then the lever arm's going to get longer. And so therefore, like a ratchet spanner really, is that you're going to be able to have a greater force production through the pedal. However, you're going to have to tolerate a lot more force, especially through your Achilles and calf muscle and further up. So track cyclists love that. Track cyclists will have a really, really distally placed cleat because they're just, flat out for a couple of seconds and a really long lever arm. Whereas as you get more endurance and come in, then you'll find that balance. And that's just a really quick, easy, simple way to describe that sort of lever arm force balance through the foot and through the heel.
And I had a text before the show actually from a friend, a mentor of mine, asking about how does the moving of the cleat proximally and distally potentially affect power output or performance. And Louise Moore's from Glasgow has just popped up a question here saying it's not so much about cleat but about orthoses. Do you ever issue them for performance enhancement or power output, and how would you measure this? So, I mean, Rob, maybe you could take the answer on cleats for power output performance, and maybe Nathan could then take the one for orthoses, if that's okay.
Yeah, so for performance, as I mentioned before, if someone's a track cyclist or going very, very short distances for just pure power output, then you put the cleat pretty much as far distally as it can go. So if you even have a look at those track cyclists coming up in the Commonwealth Games, they'll even have their toe clips at the end. So they'll have a cleat plus a toe clip at the end, and they have a really, really long lever arm. But at the same time, you have to put more force in to get more force out, and then you're also going to have to tolerate more of a reactional force from the pedal because your lever arm's longer. And so what we do with the road cyclists is we'll bring them in.
And the non-elite, the average, your weekend warrior. That sounds like there may be a bit of a trade-off there, a bit of a as there is as with everything performance versus with the
exactly right.
becoming unhappy.
Yeah, and the trade-off is that you bring it more distally, and it's actually a really good place to start if someone is getting, say, calf or Achilles overload, and they're complaining of, their calf is cramping or they're getting this calf overload while they're cycling. That's maybe one of the first places that I'll start. Is you can bring the cleat in. It'll actually bring the lever arm a little bit shorter, and it'll just really, really quickly reduce their force through their foot and calf.
Perfect. And then Nathan, orthoses for performance, that sort of magic bullet that we often talk about.
I think as soon as you start trying to use performance as a metric for orthosis prescription, you're in a pretty dangerous place. My views on it is if you're more comfortable, you're going to perform better. There's been absolutely no evidence that I've seen at any point that suggests that by putting an orthoses inside a cycling shoe, we increase the overall power output as a consequence. I think it's unlikely to do so for a few reasons, but to use a different example, we've also seen that average watts or average power by cyclists, even when we change length of crank arm, remains relatively constant as well, which is fascinating. But if that is less inclined to shift power as a consequence for a cyclist, then insole therapy, well, it's got a long way to go, hasn't it? So I think my point of view when it comes to patients who come in and say, do I get more power out of this? Because, cyclists, they do love the idea of more power. Who wouldn't want free power? It's fantastic. If you're more comfortable and you are more relaxed on the bike, and you are calmer on the bike over a long period of time, then your performance is going to improve. And if you're not spending 2 to 3 hours of a ride preparing yourself for the onset of discomfort, then you're going to be more relaxed in the ride and be able to perform better and enjoy the ride for longer as well. So as a pure metric, power before and after, I would advise strongly against issuing that as a bullet point for cycling orthotic therapy to cyclists. But if you're trying to create a more comfortable platform and hence better performance from that point of view, then for sure. And like I was saying, we've managed to create a fairly niche business in Brisbane based around treating cyclists for problems. So you don't need to be worrying about trying to give patients or clients power promises to get a caseload around cyclists. You need to make them more comfortable and understand their underlying issues. So I think if a podiatrist was asking me what is the most important part about treating cyclists and what makes my practice more cyclist friendly, you need to understand the sport of cycling and be able to understand some of the basics around cycling to allow a cyclist to feel relaxed in your practice. If you haven't got that, you're going to struggle from the outset, because if a client comes to see you and the patient prior to you is someone who's come in to have a corn removed from their fifth toe, then straight away they're going to be like, can this person handle my problem? So if you understand cycling and some of the basics around cycling, and even if you have a couple of cycling magazines strewn through your waiting room, it's amazing how much more cyclists will believe your intervention, and we'll be prepared to utilise your information as well. So understand that it's not just about feet. You need to have a little bit of understanding about the nature of cycling around it to be able to treat people.
You could also have Andy Pruitt's book on your bookcase. That would.
Look, he's for sure. BG Fit, specialised. He's probably one of the forefathers. But I think we're entering a phase now in treating cyclists where the level of science around it is getting better. The information around it is getting better. We've, like with many parts of podiatry, there's been a whole bunch of misinformation which has been useful for people to create businesses, but isn't very accurate. Whereas now we're understanding more about what we can do, and there's more clinicians who are interested in creating outcomes that are science-based rather than just, commercially based. As a consequence, we can, especially as podiatrists, as a profession, if people are prepared to treat cyclists in a scientific way, then it's a great way of advancing the profession rather than being sort of mined back in the old days of just treating, people who've got flat feet, which is one of my big bugbears.
I've got one sorry guys, I've got one last question if that's all right. I know this is about the time that Craig will start looking at his watch regularly because he gets anxious. So one last question, and it's about leg length discrepancy, leg length inequality. Now the debate about level of what point it becomes significant and reliability of measures notwithstanding. Two-part question to both of you really. Firstly, is it a big thing within the world of cycling? Because to my mind, if the legs are significantly different, then that's got to affect something negatively in one way. And secondly, if you think it is, or if Nathan, you see a lot of this, is this something that because in walking, running, we always address at the heel. I'm guessing you address full length, or do you address outside shoe at cleat level?
No, look, I can see Rob licking his lips there with this one. We're probably fortunate in a cycling context that if someone has a genuine problem which is based around a limb length discrepancy causing some pathology, our ability to make changes around that in a cycling context versus a running context is much more efficient. Like, we've got platforms that we can use. They're solid. We can go outside shoes to minimise volume occupation. It makes a big difference. So you can actually address limb lengths much more easily cycling than you can with running. That said and done, I still believe that we probably overanalyze a little bit too much. The human body and anatomy is, by its very nature, incredibly diverse and asymmetrical. And it's amazing how functional human beings can be whilst being asymmetrical. Who would have thought? So again, I think it's got to be a predictor for a problem or function output for it to be a relevant intervention. And I think there's still, as a treatment option in a bike fit context, there's a lot of fitters who will put out of shoe shims to try and shim, or lifts under cleats to try and lift up people's shorter legs and the like. And I think a good bike fitter will provide that intervention when he sees a good purpose behind it, functional pain wise, as opposed to just being, oh, I found something. I found this. Eureka. Let's jam it in there to show how smart I am. Whereas sometimes you found it, it's not relevant. Don't worry about it. Move on. And I think the other part, and Rob can do more about this because this is way more his area, is that we're talking about asymmetries and the need for shimming as a consequence. But you have to remember we're talking about like different pivot points here: ankles, knees, and hips. And if someone's limb length difference is in different locations, the intervention for that differs. So femur length versus tibial length has a very, very big difference in terms of how you treat somebody. Putting a shim under someone with a femur length difference rather than a tibial length difference can create all sorts of conundrums. So yes, it does happen, and it should happen. It probably happens more than it needs to. But if you're going to get an asymmetry balanced out through some sort of shimming in a cycling context, then please go and see a fitter for it. I won't do it personally as a podiatrist. I'll always defer to it because it's a little bit too complex, and the outcome as a consequence on the bike needs to be addressed and then often reassessed in a platform where they can actually visually see the kinematic change as a consequence. So a good bike fitter will have tools that allow them to see what they do and how that affects a person on the bike by doing that. Whereas if we do it in a podiatry room surrounded by Dr. Scholl products, we don't really know what's going to happen. So let the guys with the tech make that change. You can advise that person you found it, but defer it. Let someone else handle that shimming, unless you've got the facilities there, in which case go for your life. What do you reckon, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. It's relevant when it's relevant. I think that's what a truism. So Absolutely. Is it a big deal in cycling? Absolutely, because cycling is still very stuck. It's changing a little bit every day, but it's still very stuck in this very structural biomechanical model of, okay, we've got to get things straight, because it is when you look at someone on the bike, you don't have much medial deviation at all, and you don't want that. And so people are looking for the most perfect, structural model on the bike. And, is it relevant? Well, it can be. And two really good case studies that we had at GreenEdge is they were both very, very high performers. One was even a gold medalist at the Olympics, and he had a leg length discrepancy. But he had fantastic capacity, or he had the capacity to deal with that throughout his whole lower limb and actually into his lower back. So he actually would hitch just slightly on one side, but no pain, could perform at the highest level, no problems at all. He was happy. So are you going to do anything? No, not at all. You're not going to go chasing that rabbit just to give him a couple more watts of power. But on the other hand, a proper leg length discrepancy and where it comes from is also a big thing. Is it a proper structural leg length discrepancy? And I have seen one who, he, like a lot of cyclists, he had a bad accident when he was adolescent, disrupted his end plates, and had end up with the leg length discrepancy. Chopped him up a little bit, and perfect, away you go. So all it was 2 centimeters on one side, and he's had that since he was adolescent, and he's kept that throughout his whole career. And again, performing at the highest level. So I think we come back to really getting back down to, proper assessment. How is someone loading and their capacity to do what they want to do on the bike? Are they performing and have the capacity to perform pain-free? Then fantastic, go for it. But yeah, I think if you're going to try and chase extra watts from interventions, external interventions, it's not a good thing. It's just too difficult, because performance is based on, there's too many factors which come into performance, even ranging from emotional all the way through to physical, and sticking something under their shoe is probably not going to do much at all.
Yeah, I think that the points from this have sort of been echoed in other sessions we've done, that haven't been cycling related, and most people come back to the same tenets of being a practitioner, which is, take a good history, assess them as an individual, lean on the evidence base, no blanket approaches. I mean, it's really no different to any other patient or athlete we see, is it? Which kind of makes sense. Craig, you want to wrap up? I can see you getting anxious and nervous.
I can tell it's time to start wrapping up when my dogs are getting restless. But just one last thing I want to finish on. There was a comment earlier on about minimalist cycling shoes. Well, they I don't know.
Yeah!
I knew I'd seen him somewhere.
Yeah, but
Craig, you've broken my heart. That was what I was going to retire on that.
Yeah, but the key thing here, this was from 4 years ago. I don't know whether you can remember it, but the key thing here is the date, April the 1st, 2004. This went viral, and what I find ironic is that I still see it being linked to as though it's real, because people want to believe. And I just find that very, very amusing. But I think the last thing I want to finish on, and I see more and more podiatrists offering like package services for cyclists, a bike fit, orthoses, whatever. And I think we've got a huge scope to do this and get it right. But I hope this is still all right, Nathan, but you did offer to move your computer and give us a little look around your clinic. For those that join late, I think Nathan mentioned that something like 85% of his patients are cyclists. So this is what Nathan does. If you could give us a tour.
I think it's great in the profession that, especially in podiatry, which, it's an interesting profession to choose. But I think it's good that if we're entering a phase where if you choose to do so, you can do podiatry on your own terms. You know what I mean? You don't have to do what everybody else has done. It just means you've got to spend a long time in an area and immerse yourself there. You just can't do it overnight. But certainly it's nice that podiatry can be a bit more diverse than what we used to. I might just show you a quick share screen of what yeah, can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. So that's sort of what a basic cycling off-the-shelf device looks like.
Where's the Met Dome?
Yeah, that's right. So
It's only semi-pro, not full pro.
Right, no, it's semi-pro. I've got to get back to the main screen. I didn't know how to do that. But it's basically a very, very minimalistic device. The level of cupping around the heel is much less as well, and the profile's a bit different as well. But volume, it's all about volume. All right, I'll show you in our practice here. So it's pretty early, so there's nobody here. Normally on a Friday morning by now, we'd have a whole bunch of cyclists in here because we've got our own cafe in our business. So
that's what I'm missing.
You Aussies just love your coffee, don't you? It's ridiculous.
Yeah, so cyclists love coffee, and podiatrists who treat cyclists love coffee. And we put a full cafe into our business because just to save ourselves money from our own cafe, our own coffee consumption. But it's a nice little adjunct, and it certainly creates a nice hum of noise in the morning when everyone's coming in and grabbing a coffee. So our cafe sits through here, and then separate to that, we have our. I better turn some lights on. We have our practice, which is a combination of some retail and also some bikes. So for a podiatry practice, quite unusual. Can't see any Dr. Scholl products there or any little pictures of feet on the wall. So a lot of bikes, because we do a lot of bikes. We have a whole room set up in our practice for assessment and for training. So we have a kippy studio here with lots of little trainers that we use to assess cyclists and do some bike fitting as well. And also allows our physio to do some work whilst working at the same time. So a very unusual clinic room. We have hopefully it's nice and clean. We have a room in here we can use for massage for cyclists as well. So we have a massage therapist who works with us as well. And our treatment room in a podiatry context, we have a terminal sport. But we also have our ability to workshop for bike repairs as well. So it's a very unusual business. But because we see so many cyclists, all the other elements that we have in our business sort of feed back into it. And it's nice to be able to come to work in a location where you do get to see a certain demographic of fit and healthy people. Because by and large, even if cyclists aren't fantastic, they'd certainly try and they're heading in the right direction. So it's a bit unique, but it's nice to be able to come to work and drink coffee all day, that's for sure.
Great. Okay, guys. Well, look, thanks so much for that. For those of you who joined us late, we actually started at what was 5 a.m. for Nathan. So thanks for getting up so early. It was 6 a.m. for me. The daylight saving changes are causing a few issues. So thanks, Robert, so much. It's been a well spent hour. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, guys.
There are a few
Happy
questions.
Easter as well.
There are a few questions we didn't get to, so hopefully Nathan, Robert might stop by and answer those later. So